Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 28th of February 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me today by video link, we have Vanessa Beeley from Damascus and Charles Mallet. Well, we're going to get kicked off with protest. Of course, the narrative from James Cleverly is that MPs' lives are at risk, and therefore we've got to limit the amount of protest that's possible. Before we get to James Cleverly, let's just have a look at Tom Tugendhat speaking in the House of Commons.
Mr. Speaker, over the past few weeks, we've seen disgraceful attempts to intimidate this House, to undermine the democratic process, and to spread fear among those who've been elected to represent our country. This is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. It must end. To this House, I want to say clearly that the government will defend our democracy. We are working with the police and with Parliament to ensure that disagreements are resolved in this House through debate, not outside with threats of violence. And to those who seek to threaten this House, I say this: we will not be cowed, we will not be intimidated, and we will not be silenced. We will do whatever is necessary to protect those elected to represent us, to safeguard our freedoms, and to protect our rights. And I know I speak for colleagues across the whole House when I say we will always act in the interests of our constituents and our country.
So that's the narrative from the politicians. The question is, are they coming under pressure because they are debating things, as he claims that he wants to do? Well, of course, they're not debating things, and many of the things that people would like to see debated, they're simply refusing to debate at all, or at the very least refusing to debate in any serious way. Various requests for debates to take place being ignored or being pushed into the last state of business on a Friday afternoon, these types of things going on. But anyway, James Cleverly had this to say. He said the government will take every possible step to safeguard the people, processes and institutions upon which our democracy relies. I take safety and security of all members of the House with the utmost seriousness. So he's talking about a number of things. He's talking about limiting protest or requiring additional notice to the police. But of course, they're mainly concerned about the issue of protest outside MPs' houses. We talked about this a week or two ago with the protest that was taking place outside Tobias Elwood's property. So here is Chris Philp, who is speaking to Sky, I believe, about this issue of protest outside MPs' homes.
In relation to MPs' houses, the view we take is that that is not acceptable. No public representative, whether it's an MP, councillor or anyone, should have people outside their home address. You don't need to go to someone's house to protest. In the example you gave, I spoke to Tobias Elwood about this actually last night in Parliament, and he was actually prevented from going back to his own house with his children by essentially a mob. That is not protest. That is an attempt at intimidation.
An attempt at intimidation, possibly. I'm going to say my personal view is I don't think outside MPs' homes is the right place to be. If there's any attempt to stop people protesting outside constituency offices, I think that should be resisted absolutely. But Vanessa, I'm hijacking you here a little bit, but what are your thoughts on the issue of protest outside MPs' homes?
I mean, I agree. I don't think outside the home is particularly clever, but I think, we were talking about this the other day, that the risk here is that eventually government goes underground because of this alleged fear factor of MPs being targeted for harassment, mobbing and so on. So I think we're on a very kind of slippery slope here, and I think MPs need to recognise that the frustration and the anger that is boiling amongst their constituents is what should be addressed, not, hiding from those constituents or trying to back off from those constituents.
Well, precisely. And then that comes on to the issue of the notice period required in order to protest. And Chris Philp had something to say about that as well.
The demands being placed on policing by these repeated protests are quite significant. It's cost about £25 million so far. It's a big drain on resources. It's stopping police, obviously, looking after the communities where they would otherwise be deployed on a Saturday. Obviously, the more notice the police have, the easier it is to plan in terms of things like overtime and shifts and that kind of thing. But just to be clear, we do obviously uphold fully the right to free speech and the right to protest. We are a free democratic country.
So don't worry, we're a free democratic country and they're not attempting to shut down protest at all. Just to put this in a bit of context, just to explain that this is something that has been going on for quite some time, let's remind ourselves of this graphic. This is the legislation, some of the legislation that we've seen over the last couple of years to shut down freedom of speech with the Online Safety Act, the National Security Act, the Media Bill, which is going through at the moment. Criminalising protest, this is something that's been going on for quite a number of months now. Police Crime Courts Sentencing Act, Public Order Act, these pieces of legislation there to shut down protest. Now we're getting the excuse of risk to MPs' lives as another excuse to continue to criminalise protest. This is an extremely dangerous direction to be going in my opinion. And as Vanessa said, at the bottom line here is that we have MPs that aren't listening to their constituents. They're not debating the issues that their constituents want to debate. And of course, constituents are then heading down the route of direct action. That is normal. In the meantime, in the United States, we have had a protest described as an extreme protest, and that is Aaron Bushnell. Now, we didn't discuss this on Monday because I wanted to talk to Vanessa about it today. But let's just have a look at the words that he said to camera before he took the action of setting himself on fire outside the Israeli embassy in the United States.
Is Aaron Bushnell. I am an active duty member of the United States Air Force, and I will no longer be complicit in genocide. I'm about to engage in an extreme act of protest, but compared to what people have been experiencing in Palestine at the hands of their colonizers, it's not extreme at all. This is what our ruling class has decided will be normal.
Now, he then walked to the place where he did what he did. He poured the petrol that was in the container that he was carrying there over his head and set himself on fire. Subsequent to that, it took some time, I believe about a minute, before anybody attempted to take any action. None of the embassy staff, security staff, took any action to help him. In fact, it was somebody else that came along with a fire extinguisher. But let's just have a look at this little piece of video here. And you see the response from the Israeli embassy security staff. That is, he is already lying on the ground at this point, already pretty much dead. But their response is to be pointing a gun at him. They think that he is some kind of risk. I can't quite get my head around the mentality and the thinking here. The response has been quite amazing. And in New York yesterday, this vigil, now it was being pushed out on social media as a vigil for Aaron Bushnell. Of course, it wasn't for him. It was for the people of Gaza. It was in his name, though. And in this case, in Times Square, they rolled out this printout of all the names of the people that have been killed in Gaza in the last few months. So Aaron Bushnell taking a pretty extreme point of view here and an extreme action. Now, yesterday, I interviewed Jose Vega, who many of you will know the name because he has come to notoriety over the last couple of years for taking direct action himself and walking into public events and challenging editors of newspapers, politicians, and so on. And those videos have largely gone viral. Now, he's standing for Congress in New York now, and I spoke to him yesterday. We're going to put that video out next week, but I just want to show a clip from that where he was discussing what Aaron Bushnell did.
I have to bring this up. The guy who committed self-immolation yesterday, a guy burned himself alive, I think in front of an Israeli embassy. He I think his last words were something like, "I'm about to commit an extreme act of protest, but nothing as extreme as what the people of Palestine are going through." And honestly, it really does break my heart that this young man, 25 years old, right? The fact that this guy is the same age as me, and I'm deciding to run for Congress, and he decides to burn himself alive as a way to protest what's going on. He is a service. He, by the very virtue of being in the military, has decided that his life, the meaning of his life, will be to protect and serve his country and serve its best interests. And he has now felt that there is no recourse from the genocide that the United States and Israel is actively committing. And he did not want to be a pawn to it. He did not want to take orders. I think there was something that Max Blumenthal shared this recently, that the Air Force was giving orders that, the Air Force is supposed to help in the air space in Israel or something. And so this soldier's like, "I'm not doing that." And he decided to burn himself alive. I mean, that is an extreme act of protest, as he said. And my heart just breaks about the fact that he felt as if he had to do that. And I think our responsibility right now for us that are living has to be to provide a living alternative to the problems and the pessimism of the world. And my heart breaks for him. We will mourn him and his family. And I don't want to let his death go in vain. And I look at it and it's like, my job is to make sure that nobody else has to burn themselves alive to get a message out there and tell the truth about what's going on.
Vanessa, that's all our jobs, isn't it? Everyone.
Yeah, and I mean, what's extraordinary is how the mainstream media has portrayed this as suicide, and they've even tried to, within 24 hours, smear him. The only thing that they could find, which was published in the New York Times, was that he was an anarchist and that he grew up in a religious compound. That was the biggest dirt that they could dig up on him. But I mean, basically, they've tried to erase the story and lessen the story because, of course, it reflects horribly on the Biden administration and the bipartisan role in enabling and actually taking part in the genocide of Palestinians by Israel with US weapons.
Yes. Thank you, Vanessa. Charles, let me welcome you to the programme and another form of protest, which is the farmers. And what's the situation then here in the UK?
Thanks, Mike, and good afternoon. Yes, you'll be aware from Alex Thompson that there have been protests across Europe, farmers very much dissatisfied with the conditions they find themselves in. And as we broadcast now, there is a gathering of farmers in Cardiff, outside the Senate, Cardiff in Wales. And this has been posted here on Twitter by the No Farmers, No Food campaign. I highlight the tweet and indeed the article that it comes from. It is challenging at this stage to get an idea really on the messaging and communications front. The No Farmers, No Food campaign was set up by somebody called James Melville, who's in fact a Scot and not a farmer. But this does seem to be the banner that farmers are coalescing underneath at the moment. And the sense of protest right now is in response to what's called the Sustainable Farming Scheme, something that's been put forward by the Welsh Government. You'll see the red arrow pointing to the deadline date of the 7th of March 2024. And since devolution, each authority will have the powers effectively to set the conditions for funding schemes for farmers. And the Welsh Government have put forward this consultation, some of which has been deemed extremely controversial because it's perceived that it pushes farmers towards a position in which they're not able to cultivate food, and therefore that places their businesses under threat. So we'll just look at a bit of the text itself and indeed the preface from the Minister that's put it forward, Leslie Griffiths, the Minister for Rural Affairs and North Wales. And she says in her statement at the front of this document, the urgency of the climate and nature emergency cannot be overstated. Its effects are impacting on our ecosystems, altering the very fabric of our world, and pose significant threats to our agricultural and food systems. Recognising this, our focus on sustainable policies, innovative strategies and collaborative efforts is paramount in mitigating the adverse effects of climate change while ensuring a resilient future for all. Now, the reason I've highlighted cannot be overstated is that I think we are all aware by now that they have very much been overstated. And therefore, the scientific premise for changing a payment scheme on this basis is flimsy, to say the least. And it is interesting to note at this point, it's not actually that that's being challenged, but it seems pertinent to point it out now, as I'm sure it'll be something that is returned to as a theme. One thing that is critical to observe, which I've pulled out of the document, is that the amount of money that the Welsh Government has available to fund this scheme is not clear. In terms of our approach to payments, whilst our current position is that we do not know how much funding will be available to the Welsh Government as a whole, we do, however, look at how we propose to provide a universal baseline payment to farmers for carrying out a set of universal actions. So essentially a carrot and stick situation, which it seems at the moment farmers feel that they have little option but to subscribe to. It is worth saying that the basic payment scheme at the moment is still available at least until the end of 2024, but the challenging, or at least the controversial part, is on screen now, which is the habitat baseline review. A requirement for the scheme will be for you to actively manage at least 10% of your land as habitat to benefit biodiversity, and you will need to have or work towards 10% tree cover. So as I say, farmers are feeling that if they want to take advantage of effective sort of funding that was there for different purposes, they have to change very substantially the nature of what it is they're doing. There are, within the document, there are provisions about how to change the way that people farm without, in fact, taking food out of production. So I've got some of the points on screen now. Soil health planning, multi-species cover crop, integrated pest management, effectively trying to remove chemicals from the soil and improve the soil quality. So it would be unfair to report this as purely a push towards nature recovery, which seems to be what's being done in England. But there are some initiatives within this which are to do with improving farming practices, or at least improving the quality of soil that farmers are using. This leads into what I've reported on previously to do with DEFRA, who are managing the situation in England via the environmental land management schemes, and how that's changed. And I thought I'd point out correspondence that I've had with the press office at DEFRA. Following the last broadcast on this at the end of January, I challenged them, or at least asked for further information, because it wasn't clear at what point DEFRA might have to step in and stop land being taken out of food production. So I wrote back to them to say the information published today implies that there is no upper limit on the funding available for each application. Is this correct, or is there a limit as a percentage of total land managed? With such grants in place and the likely take-up, what figures will DEFRA allow the utilised agricultural area and the total croppable areas to decrease to? And then I quoted back the figures that they had given, which was in effect 8.8 million hectares, and that the croppable area was just over half of that, 55%, and grassland had already decreased across 2023 by nearly 3%. So my question was, what is the minimum permitted area by hectare of the utilised agricultural area? And as a percentage of the UAA, the croppable area, what measures does DEFRA have in place to avoid a significant reduction? Well, they came back to me confirming there is no upper limit. So effectively across the border in England, it's possible to put your entire farm into the countryside stewardship scheme and therefore not cultivate any food at all, yet still be paid for it. DEFRA maintained that producing food and protecting diversity should go hand in hand. They don't really articulate how that can happen, especially if they're incentivising people to de-risk and not produce food. And they've also designed the schemes to pay farmers for measures that can increase that can make their food producing businesses more resilient and so forth. They talk further about this, and indeed they say that the UAA has remained broadly stable and that countryside stewardship agreements have doubled. Now, this is disingenuous because, of course, in actual fact, people have transferred onto countryside stewardship from previous schemes. So to say that it's doubled is really a meaningless statistic. But what's sort of dropped out of this is that the DEFRA press office has decided that they specifically said they're not going to be drawn into commenting on hypotheticals. It looks very much like the press office is acting as a gatekeeper, deciding whether or not to release specific bits of information as opposed to simply telling one whether they have it or not. But the critical thing here, and especially when we think to what's going on in Wales, is that DEFRA cannot confirm that any plan or contingency is in place in case of a significant reduction of the total croppable area due to farmers seeking to de-risk their businesses. Because the press office were either reluctant to or couldn't confirm whether or not there was a plan, I've written to the Minister, Steve Barclay, who has yet to respond. Now, why does any of this matter? It's because when we look at the future, we see documents like this written in 2019, which anticipates the sort of future in which farmers play very, very little part. And I will just quickly finish on this. By 2025, we will be eating our way to a healthy planet population, stemming from the unstoppable rise of public awareness of how our food impacts not only our individual health, but the health of the environment. Our palates, hungry for ecological public health, will become more and more adventurous in using food as a tool for environmental action. Well, if you've managed to stomach that, then you can go into the longer document and see exactly what it is that Sainsbury's have been writing about. But essentially, the premise of all of this is essentially a false one, to be declaring that the climate emergency, such as it is, or such as it purports to be, should dictate that wholesale change is wrought, does not quite add up.
Yes, well, we'll talk a little bit more about that extra, I've no doubt. Now, if you like what the UK Column does, you'd like to support us, please have a look at support.ukcolumn.org. And every way that you can support us is there. You could pick up something at the UK Column shop. Now, unfortunately, this will be the last batch of MHRA Not Fit for Purpose T-shirts with June Rain's face on it, because she is leaving the MHRA later in the year. Well, this perhaps is not a coincidence, because, of course, no sooner had we produced the Variants of Concern T-shirt a couple of years ago than one of the faces on there, Matt Hancock, resigned. So basically, pick up your MHRA T-shirt if you can, because there won't be any more of them. But if you want to see somebody else go, then maybe you want to propose a couple of T-shirt designs for us, because it seems like every time we produce a T-shirt design, somebody leaves their job. So do help us out with that if you can. You could also share any material on the various platforms, especially ukcolumn.org, ukcolumnextracts.co.uk. Now, there's been quite a bit of interest in the Climate Science Masterclass that David Siegel is going to be running with us. That's going to start in March. So a few weeks to get signed up to that if you would like to. There is a cost to it. The details are at climatecourse.ukcolumn.org if you'd like to join us for that. We would encourage as many people as possible to, and then take that information and challenge net zero policy around the country. Getting together with Alan Miller, I was discussing the Together Association and their campaigns with Alan Miller yesterday at 1 p.m. That's on the UK Column website if you'd like to go and see that, if you haven't seen it yet. And tomorrow, Brian will be speaking to Justin Walker at 1 o'clock about the Bradbury Pound. So join us at 1 p.m. for that if you can. Quick reminder of AV14 coming up soon. On the Sunday, the 26th of May. Tickets still available for that if you'd like to go. Also, Stand in the Light festival taking place in Cumbria near Workington, May 24th to 27th. Pick up your tickets for that if you can as well. And finally, the Sounds Beautiful Festival. The promo code for that is UK Column if you would like to win the price of your tickets, or perhaps some tickets for somebody else. But anyway, tickets available for that. Details on screen at the moment. Vanessa, let's welcome you back to the programme and move on to the question of Egypt and whether it's going to provide security for Palestinians pushed out of Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, this is a question that's very prevalent at the moment. Interesting, after we did the report on the Sinai Human Rights Foundation that had reported on the construction by Egypt close to the border, they've been now pretty heavily attacked by the Egyptian government that is denying all stories reference Palestinian refugees being housed in what is effectively an open-air prison on Egyptian territory. So I'm also going to bring together today, because we've covered the NEOM project on a number of occasions, but this is a report from August 2022 in Al Monitor, Saudi Arabia's NEOM project to bring huge investments to Egypt. And why is this important in relation to the Palestinian refugee issue we'll come to? But Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman recently revealed his country's plan to pump huge investments into Egypt to complete the Saudi NEOM project, including in the Sharm el-Sheikh tourist area on the Red Sea coast. And just moving on to the next slide, because there it also says Egypt and Saudi Arabia have signed a series of investment agreements in March 2018 and set up a 10 billion joint fund to develop about 1,000 square kilometers of Egyptian lands in southern Sinai to be part of the NEOM project. Now, what's interesting here is Clayton Morris of Redacted told me he went to northern Sinai fairly recently, certainly since the 7th of October, and he told me that there is huge money pouring in from Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Jordan. And if we have a look, so here I've just highlighted on this map, obviously Eilat in the southern occupied territories of Israel is only 60 kilometers from the Saudi NEOM project. And if we look at the next slide, we can see where they're intending to basically connect. So this is taken from the NEOM website. The 500 billion plan includes a bridge spanning the Red Sea to Egypt, southern Sinai, and an urban development of 10,000 square miles. Now, added to Saudi Arabia's investment on the back of its NEOM project, we have Gulf investments in Egypt to keep the economy afloat and provide benefits in return. The UAE and Saudi Arabia are effectively looking at investment in Egyptian ports, and particularly, as it says here, especially the UAE, have deployed a strategy of investing in port infrastructures and securing or controlling strategic regional trade routes. Of course, this is also connected to the India-Middle East economic corridor that we've also spoken about before. And then let's have a look at the connection of this to the Abraham Accords, which were basically a series of treaties normalizing diplomatic relations between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, facilitated, of course, by the US administration between August and December 2020. Now, while Qatar has not yet normalized relations officially, with Israel, they are pushing heavily certain trade deals, like in 2021, the diamond trade deal. So they are certainly pushing economic relations with Israel. And the UAE was the first to normalize relations with Israel in August 2020. We then, of course, have various reports. I just picked one off a search that I did, cashing in on genocide. Israeli firm pitches beachfront real estate and level Gaza. As I said, there are multiple reports on this, on Israeli real estate companies already eyeing up Gazan beachfront territory for real estate development. And of course, who would benefit from this kind of real estate development? Well, this is a report from 2021 in Haaretz. Egypt's monopoly on rebuilding Gaza serves both Israel and Hamas. But of course, what it does do is to give Sisi's government and his various warlord associates in the Sinai monopoly on this kind of reconstruction in Gaza in collaboration with Israel. And then this is a very interesting article that came out a couple of days ago. Will Egypt accept Palestinian displacement in exchange for debt relief? I recommend everybody actually reads the article because there's a lot of information in there, but I've taken out just one section. So Riyadh's sudden eagerness to bolster economic ties with Cairo is palpable, with unprecedented directives from both governments. Mutual investments are set to soar, with Saudi Arabia aiming to ramp up trade to 100 billion. Recent collaborations include a 4 billion deal with Saudi-listed ACWA Power for the green hydrogen project. Moreover, strategic initiatives like the Memorandum of Understanding between the Egyptian Ministry of Military Production and the Saudi General Authority for Military Industries and agreements in petroleum and mineral resources signal deepening economic integration. And then if we also look at a report, I think from 2023, yes. So this is from the European Council on Foreign Relations, Tipping Point, the Risks of Palestinian Displacement for Egypt. But hidden in the text of this report, which again people can go and check out, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has firmly rejected apparently any scenario leading to the forced relocation of Gazans into its Sinai Peninsula. But of course, we have seen the evidence of a construction of some kind of open-air compound. So too, allegedly, has the United States. But in private, the Egyptian government was reported to be mulling a US offer to write off 160 billion in Egyptian debt in return for hosting 100,000 Gazan refugees, with, of course, the Israeli campaign in Rafah looming. And in October, the White House asked Congress for additional funding to address potential needs of Gazans fleeing to neighboring countries. And of course, the precedent of the US writing off Egyptian debt in return for their support of the 1991 war against Iraq was set back then. So this is nothing new. But then if we also look at Egypt's debt to Gulf countries, we can see that the UAE and Saudi Arabia hold about 20% of that debt. So there is huge interest for Egypt in developing those trade relations and investment from Saudi Arabia and UAE. And finally, of course, Egypt must be interested in the development of the offshore gas exploration off the shore of Gaza, but also off the shore pretty much of Lebanon and Syria. And that amounts to 22.9 trillion cubic feet, of recoverable gas. So basically, I think what it all points to, it's certainly in Egypt's interest to enable a compound for Palestinians being driven out of Palestinian territory in Gaza, with an eye on development of that territory for Israeli real estate companies, for the gas, but also the fact that they would want to enclose the Palestinians and basically hide them away from the massive development that is going on in the Sinai. And that began, of course, with the destruction of the Egyptian Bedouin homes in Rafah, which began as far back as 2013, and also in the knowledge that since 2007, Egypt has been instrumental in the blockade of Palestinians, and various governments have been involved in the flooding of the lifeline Palestinian tunnels between Gaza and Egypt with sewage water. So Saudi Arabia has cracked down on pro-Palestinian protests, so it is clearly not seeing the Palestinian cause as a priority. And I would say that all of these countries, Gulf states, Jordan, that have normalized relations with Israel, they very much see the Palestinian cause as something that is getting in the way of their profiteering on trade relations with Israel. And so therefore, I think it's extremely likely that Egypt is collaborating with Israel and with the Gulf states in providing an alternative for Palestinians that are potentially going to be driven out of southern Gaza.
And where's Russia and China in all this?
Well, I mean, China has actually been very condemnatory, particularly of the US latest veto. I mean, they used incredibly strong language in their pushback against that when Algeria basically put forward a resolution for an all out ceasefire. I think, Russia and China, well, China particularly has a policy of not getting involved in external military adventurism by the US alliance. Russia has its hands full with Ukraine and with the Middle East, with its military base inside Syria, of course. However, Russia has been increasing its military bases on the border with the Israeli illegally annexed Golan territory, which of course is Syrian territory, but occupied by Israel since 1967. So I think both of them are keeping a relatively low profile. But as regards diplomatic process, I think both of them are being very outspoken about the US involvement in what is going on in Palestine.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you. Let's move on. Well, a bit more war, or is it? Because the position of the military leadership in the UK becomes ever more laughable. So let's bring Admiral Sir Tony Radakin on screen. He was speaking at Chatham House in the last day or two. So he began by saying that he wanted to reassure us all, anybody that's been alarmed by some of the recent commentary, Britain is secure, so we don't need to worry about anything. Britain is secure. And to remind us all of the extraordinary security we have through both our being in NATO and our being in nuclear power. So that's good news, isn't it? So let's see what was next. He said, secondly, some reflections and observations about Russia, how it has struggled in Ukraine. I'm not sure what or if he's been taking some kind of drugs, but this is just an incredible position that he's taking here. How we've been surprised at Russia's military weakness, the predicament that it now has, and how that is worsened by a strengthened NATO. NATO has spent all its munitions on Ukraine so far, and we haven't the manufacturing capability to replace them faster than we are depleting them. So I'm not clear how he can, with a straight face, take this position. He went on to say, let me scotch some of the more sensationalist headlines of late. We're not on the cusp of a war with Russia. We're not about to be invaded. No one in the Ministry of Defence is talking about conscription in any traditional sense of the term. So, Charles, I don't know what your thoughts are on this so far, but that's a very telling statement. They're not talking about conscription in any traditional sense of the term, but they're clearly talking about it.
Yeah, I think history suggests that the only reason you ever tell anyone you're not talking about something is specifically so that you can then talk about it. And I'm sure that with conscription, that would be exactly the case. I mean, he's splitting hairs. And as you say, what is he talking about? It's like they're reading sort of randomly generated briefs on all of this, because you could easily find something that Grant Shapps or Patrick Sanders, the Chief of the General Staff, have said that completely contradict what Radakin has come out and said there, as well as Stoltenberg at NATO as well. So I don't know why he would say such a thing, but specifically with conscription, it's utterly irresponsible to even mention it if you're not in some way considering it. I think it would be completely reasonable to believe that they are in some way considering it, although maybe not in the traditional sense.
Yes. Okay, so let's move on with what he said. So let's look at the next bit, if we could, Stephanie, please. So here we are. This is an alliance that is becoming stronger all the time. He's talking about NATO, of course, growing from 30 to 32 nations. So NATO expansionism continues apace, with collective GDP 20 times greater than Russia and a total defense budget 3.5 times more than Russia and China combined. And yet we have a capability 3.5 times less that of Russia and China combined. This is a very interesting point, and we'll talk about that more in due course. But he then went on to say, when we were unable to sail one of our aircraft carriers, our people worked around the clock to deploy the second in a matter of days. That's the real story, and it's a phenomenal achievement. So is it, again, with a straight face, he is apparently saying that we spent whatever numbers of tens of billions of pounds on 2 aircraft carriers. The fact that we were able to get one of them to sea while the other one was stuck in dry dock was a phenomenal achievement. This is an incredible position for the Chief of the Defence Staff to be taking. But don't worry, it's not just ships, it's also helicopters. And at the moment, yesterday, today and tomorrow, the International Military Helicopter event is taking place in London at the moment. And James Carledge was there. He is the procurement minister. He was there to talk about the new contract for helicopters that the UK government is putting out. He said, now, over the decades, UK governments have commissioned, procured and upgraded numerous platforms, including many iconic names that you're all very familiar with, including Lynx and others that everybody, of course, will be familiar with. He said, I've had the privilege of flying a number of them, recently aboard one of our Wildcats, flying to Yeovilton to see how artificial intelligence has improved their support and, crucially, their availability. So they're using artificial intelligence to make sure the helicopter is available, but they're not using artificial intelligence to make sure the aircraft carriers are available, apparently. But anyway, he went on to say, our next generation medium lift helicopters will deliver a Swiss Army knife platform, future-proofed and procured in a way to give the UK Armed Forces and our defence sector maximum clout and flexibility. So he was saying this yesterday. But a couple of days ago, he was at Malloy Aeronautics to see the latest in military drones. The UK is simply going to be spending the small amount of £4.5 billion on the drone project in the coming couple of years. But getting back onto the helicopters themselves, I'm not sure exactly how much they're intending to spend on this. This will become clear in the near future, but bids are now open for a new medium helicopter contract as it moves to the invitation to negotiate phase. And the new helicopter model will support defence operations around the globe. The aircraft carriers can't, but the aircraft themselves will. So the three preferred bidders are Airbus Helicopters UK, not a UK company, of course, Leonardo Helicopters UK, an Italian company that swallowed up Westland and other, and Augusta and so on, Lockheed Martin UK, again, ultimately not a UK-based company, taking part in that. So we will keep you posted on how this competition for the next generation of helicopters goes. And maybe someday we'll have a ship, an aircraft carrier to fly them off. But Charles, let's move on to Somalia.
Thanks, Mike. You may remember back in January, I spoke about controversy surrounding the port of Berbera in Somaliland, in Somalia, and the apparent declaration of recognition of sovereignty of Somaliland by Ethiopia in return for access to the coastline of Somaliland. Now, the FCDO did not decide to comment on the questions I put to them about this. They released one message on Twitter or X expressing their hope that all parties concerned would sort of effectively remain calm. So the flavour of this segment, in fact, is characterised by messages on X. That seems to be the way the Foreign Office do business these days, but also the MOD. We see here that James Heappey, a minister within the MOD, has visited Mogadishu and has met with the president of Somalia. So again, you can see they split the cost of the photographer. The president, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, welcomes the UK Minister for Armed Forces. So what have they been talking about, and why was Heappey there? The UK government reports by saying that James Heappey, UK Minister for Armed Forces, said Somalia is a key partner for the UK and is vital to security and stability across the region. My visit enabled me to see firsthand the impact of UK-Somalia security cooperation, as well as encourage greater collaboration and deconfliction with key international partners, including the UN, the US, and the EU. The challenges facing Somalia are complex, but we remain steadfast supporters of the efforts of the federal government to take the fight to al-Shabaab, take greater control of domestic security, and deliver a secure and stable future for the Somali people. I've highlighted parts of that text because it comes across as being in some ways patronising, but also suggestive of the fact that in actual fact, relations between the UK and Somalia aren't nearly so important as relations between the UK and the UN, the EU, and the US. So Heapy had a little bit to say about it. There's another message on X now, which I'll just put on the screen. Again, this is from the Somalia side of it. Sorry, that is an important correction. I do not mean Somaliland, I mean Somalia. But they talk about the shared commitment to enhancing security and combating international terrorism in Somalia. They talk about collaborative effort and all the rest of it. So effectively, they're all making the right noises about this. Again, going back to the partnerships that at least that James Heapy was talking about, we see here that this partnership even has a nickname, the Quad. This is sent by the British ambassador to Somalia. And he says partner cooperation by the Quad, meaning the EU, the US, the UN, and the UK, is vital to ensuring a secure, sustainable future for Somalia. So again, there is more than a whiff of sort of neo-imperialism about this, as though these organizations are allowing Somalia to conduct certain activities, and at some point in the future that's yet to be determined, Somalia will perhaps on its own 2 feet. Now, the timing of this is interesting because this was dated 26th of February. On the 22nd of February, the federal government of Somalia released a statement saying that they had signed an agreement, a defence and economic cooperation agreement with Turkey. And again, we have to look to X to find out a little bit more detail, but from the president himself, I signed and ratified the Defence and Economic Cooperation Agreement between the Federal Republic of Somalia and the Republic of Turkey. This historic agreement marks a new chapter in our nation's journey towards a secure and prosperous future. The agreement embodies a shared commitment to combating all forms of illegal activities and will enable us to build a capable naval force essential for our maritime security. So he's been quite specific there. He goes on to talk about bolstering our blue economy, developing crucial economic sectors, and creating opportunities for our people and the region. Now, some of that is obviously relatively bland, but it is worth noting that the specific reference to a naval capability is not something really that the UK, or indeed the Quad, as quoted, has talked about much. So, in effect, we can see this sort of scrapping going on over the territory of Somalia, and we shouldn't forget that although, of course, the United Kingdom is, to all intents and purposes, outside of the European Union, it still has an awful lot to do with it, and Somalia is one such case. The European Commission showing here that they're aiming to deliver a comprehensive level of support to Somali National Army under the European Peace Facility. This is released just over a week ago, and from that they specify the amount of money that's sort of moving across here, which is their Commission's Service for Foreign Policy Instruments acts as administrator for assistance measures under the EPF. It also supports Somalia with crisis response, conflict prevention, and peace-building actions for an amount of 41.5 million euros for the period 2023 to 2024, covering notably rapid stabilisation in newly recovered areas. So there's an awful lot of money moving through the system, in particular in Somalia. But the other bit, and again, I go back to the reference to the Navy, is of course the strategic position and access to the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, something that's been talked about an awful lot, but never really with specific reference to Somalia or Somaliland. But of course, just a reminder that the port of Berbera, which is controlled by DP World, a UAE-based company, also has a very large port in Turkey, DP World Yarmouth, and this is just a slide to show that and really to act as a reminder of all the different influences that are being brought to the fore here. So it seems like James Heapy's visit to Somalia is by no means a random one, but of course there will still be struggles ahead as to who does get to control the sort of strategic waters and indeed the inland areas surrounding the port of Berbera in particular.
Charles, thank you very much for that. Vanessa, bring us up to date with Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, I know that we generally don't show it's not long, but it's 3 minutes. I'd also like to make the point, I don't know who made this video. It's very well done. But if anybody does know, or any UK column viewers made it, please could you reach out and let us know. I have been asking everyone that's been sharing it, but nobody seems to have an idea. Basically, what this shows very clearly is how Israel has conducted the genocide in Gaza in particular, covering every single area from health to education to agriculture and farming, and how each sector has been deliberately targeted by Israel. So let's just play the video, Mike.
This is the map published by The Guardian on the 30th of January showing the extent of the destruction wreaked in Gaza by Israeli bombardment since the 7th of October last year. It's shocking enough in itself, but when you cross-reference it with other maps, you begin to get a sense of the way in which the conditions of life in Gaza have been systematically annihilated by Israeli forces. This is a map showing every residential building in Gaza before 7th of October. This is what was left as of the end of January, and of course the destruction continues across the territory, but particularly right now in Rafah. Here is a map of greenhouses in Gaza before the Israeli bombardment. Greenhouses are a lifeline for many Gazan families, providing greater and more secure access to healthy foods. This is what is left of those now. And of course, without a functioning water supply, even most of these have been rendered unusable. Also, in terms of food security, here are Gaza's warehouses before the Israeli carpet bombing, and what's left. This is a map of tree crops in Gaza before the destruction began, including fruit trees and olive trees, which have provided food for residents and been among Gaza's major exports. This is what currently remains undamaged. This map shows all private schools, Palestinian Authority schools, UNRWA schools and universities running in Gaza before the 7th of October. And here are those that haven't yet been destroyed. None of these is of course currently able to function as such in any case. Here is a map of major health facilities in Gaza before Israeli forces began to attack them, including prenatal facilities, mental health facilities, clinics and hospitals. And here is what remains. All of this destruction would take many decades to restore, although of course it seems unlikely that those who built and grew all that has been pulverized by the Israeli bombardment will even be allowed to return to do so. One prominent feature of this map emerges when you subtract the destruction caused to built-up areas, which have been more or less annihilated. Here you can see a line of destruction stretching down through the center of the territory. This particular swathe of bombardment aligns with the so-called humanitarian corridor announced by Israel along Salah al-Din Street in November last year. When residents of Gaza City in the north were ordered to evacuate, they were promised safe passage along this street. However, many witnesses have described Salah al-Din Street as a corridor of death and humiliation. Civilian convoys and vehicles have been repeatedly bombed and targeted, and testimonies from dozens of witnesses collected in Gaza by journalist Tarek Hajjaj describe Palestinians having been summarily executed and killed by Israeli snipers, including children, their parents ordered by their murderers to abandon their bodies by the side of the road. According to the testimonies, people were made to crawl on their bellies through checkpoints, forced to undress and descend into pits filled with dead bodies, sometimes to be shot, sometimes to be released, among many other horrors. The street is littered with the bodies of men, women and children in various states of decomposition. There are millions of horror stories like these behind these simple red swatches, which delineate the annihilation of a people.
I don't think there's anything to add to that. I mean, it's a horrifying indictment.
Thank you, Vanessa, for that. Okay, Charles, let's come back to you and to health. Well, what is reaching the last mile all about?
Thanks, Mike. Reaching the last mile seems to be an umbrella term. This is a poster from COP28, which actually refers to a multitude of things, but it's really the inference that remote communities are somehow harmed by their remoteness, and that therefore everybody has to do everything they can to ensure that they have everything that they might need. And again, we see here Last Mile Health, an organisation that seems to be positing that there is somehow a relationship between remoteness and poor health, even though they don't go on to explain exactly how that's the case or provide any evidence. But nonetheless, they've launched an African initiative. And last week, when I was talking about my visit to Revital Healthcare, the provider of the non-reusable syringes, it came up that the government of Kenya is going to be putting outreach workers, effectively last mile workers, into the community to educate. And then, of course, this will be followed up by testing and then, lo and behold, provision of the very medicine that is recommended for whatever it is the test shows that people have. So Last Mile Health here, professionalising 200,000 community health workers across 10 African countries by 2030. And they're by no means alone in becoming involved in this. I think it's always interesting to look at who holds the purse strings. Here we have the key supporters, which are in effect a mixture of philanthropists or so-called philanthropists, bankers, and pharmaceutical companies. The ones that might jump out are the usual suspects: the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, USAID, and so forth. So, of course, that's not a huge surprise to see that those are they. Again, an illustration of how widespread this is. This is Virgin celebrating Last Mile Health's 2023 milestone. So this is a bandwagon that everybody seems to be jumping on. But as I say, there's no real evidence to suggest that there is a requirement or indeed a correlation between remoteness and ill health to the degree that something like this has to be done about it. And indeed, there's no suggestion that, of course, any activities that are conducted would be done in such a way as to monitor whether or not they are making a positive or negative impact. They're just riding straight into this particular valley, deciding this is what is to be done. And we'll just go into a little bit more detail here to get a flavour of what it is they're doing and how they're doing it. Last Mile Health here declaring that community health worker training drives improvements in childhood immunisation rates in Ethiopia. As I say, it's nothing to do with monitoring health. It is simply metrics by which they can articulate how many drugs have been consumed by people and therefore how much money has swirled through the system. But as I say here, it is simply the childhood immunisation rate. And just to quote from that document, in 2021, Ethiopia's Ministry of Health estimated that nearly 800,000 children across the nation had received 0 doses of routine childhood vaccines. Facing a serious risk of illness or death from preventable causes, nearly 90% of these children were concentrated in 4 regions. In 2023, having identified immunisation as an urgent community health priority, the ministry launched a new partnership with Last Mile Health and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, to address these needs through new evidence-based training for community health workers in the regions and Woredas most in need, Woredas being an Ethiopian term for, in fact, a regional, a sort of administrative region. So again, here, the complete absence of evidence that this is actually required. It's just a stark statement that this number of people have not been immunised and therefore they must be immunised, as opposed to identifying whether there is, in fact, any sort of problem in the system first. It hasn't stopped the World Health Organization from jumping in. And the slide I've got here, I would just draw your attention to the text at the bottom, which is hard to read, but this is talking about the Last Mile Health training tool. And it just seems slightly laughable, but in their description, they say it's primarily a tool for frontline health workers, helping them to do away with bulky and expensive textbooks and other traditional training materials. I would say that sounds a little bit alarming, to think that whatever it is that is going to be informing these at the expense of information that was previously regarded as being perfectly reliable. And I'll just conclude by articulating in a way, the massive hypocrisy of these sorts of schemes. And here we have a promotion from, of all companies, the Coca-Cola company, who've probably got to shoulder more of the blame for Africa's ill health across all age groups and in monstrous plastic pollution than most companies. But anyway, nonetheless, they have got Project Last Mile, and they say that it's Coca-Cola company's pioneering partnership to strengthen health systems by leveraging our distribution and system network. And they finish by asking this question: if you can find a Coca-Cola product almost anywhere in Africa, why not life-saving medicines? Well, indeed. And essentially what that boils down to, you can make money by selling Coca-Cola to the world's most remote communities. You should be able to do the same by putting pharmaceutical products into their arms. So that's the disappointing reality of the last mile health sort of initiative, and indeed the rhetoric surrounding it. And I think we're going to see an awful lot more of this.
Okay, thank you, Charles. Thank you very much for that. Okay, well, we are going to have to finish there, but we've got just one final meme to show at the end. And this is a lady holding up a placard saying every man with a pair of testicles is voting for Donald Trump in 2024. And underneath that, it says every woman with a pair of testicles is voting for Joe Biden in 2024. Does that sound about right? And I think that probably does sound about right. So we will leave you with that thought for today. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Charles and Vanessa for joining me. And we will be back for a little bit of extra if you're a UK Column member in a couple of minutes. But otherwise, we will see you on Friday at 1 p.m. as usual. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.